So for this outcome you need to state for aerobic and anaerobic conditions the products of decomposition of organic matter containing carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus or sulfur. So this is all about decay. So if we look at some of the compounds that make up living things, so we've got carbohydrates here, proteins, lipids, they contain elements that get recycled back into the environment. So carbohydrates contain carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. Proteins have those as well as nitrogen and sometimes sulfur as well. And lipids are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen too. So when a thing dies, those compounds get broken down so that those elements can be reused in the environment. Most natural decay processes are chemical reactions that take place in bacteria and other microbes. What they do is they take the really big complex compounds like the polymers and they break them down into much smaller compounds, and when they do that, energy is released. And they use that energy to run their metabolism. So rather than photosynthesizing, for example, they'll just consume organic matter that's around them and release the energy from the large compounds when they turn it into small compounds. So there's two groups of microbes. We're talking about aerobic or anaerobic here. So if they're aerobic, that means they require oxygen to do their breakdown process. If they're anaerobic, that means they function only when there's very little oxygen or no oxygen available for them to do that. And because of that, you get different compounds being produced, whether something is broken down aerobically or anaerobically. So if we look at some places we can get anaerobic conditions, for example, in wetlands and swamps, down the bottom there, you have a lot of vegetative matter, you have very low oxygen levels in the water, so that's where you can get that anaerobic decomposition of carbon-containing compounds mainly. If you have a look at a modern rubbish dump, you have the rubbish there, and they have a system in place in a lot of rubbish dumps these days to collect the methane gas that's produced from anaerobic decay, and we'll talk about where that comes from later. And over here we just have an example of some bacteria that can do this. So this is the main thing that you need to have a look at. So we're focusing on carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus because that's what the student outline tells us to do. In aerobic conditions, carbon gets turned into carbon dioxide, and that's a gas that goes back out into the atmosphere. In anaerobic conditions, though, we don't have any oxygen available, so we get methane being produced, CH4. And that can be problematic because methane in the atmosphere is a much more dangerous greenhouse gas. It traps a lot more heat energy than carbon dioxide does, but the benefit is it also does fall out quicker. So there are issues with methane being produced as well as carbon dioxide. If we look at sulfur, so when sulfur is broken down aerobically, it produces sulfate ions. Hydrogen sulfide is the anaerobic decomposition product, and hydrogen sulfide has another name, rotten egg gas. It's also quite toxic in large concentrations. If we have a look at phosphorus here, so in aerobic conditions it produces the phosphate ion. That's quite handy because that can be absorbed by plants, so the phosphate produced can just be reabsorbed by plants and it's just recycled that way. Phosphine gas is the anaerobic decomposition product, and again, that's problematic. It can be quite toxic. Lastly, nitrogen. So nitrogen, when it breaks down aerobically, we get the oxygen in there, so we make nitrate ions. Nitrate ions are water soluble again, and they can be absorbed by plants, so that's handy. Ammonia, on the other hand, the anaerobic decomposition product, ammonia is quite smelly. It's basic, and it can have big issues if it's left in the environment in large quantities. So we can see that there's more environmental issues usually associated with anaerobic products of decay rather than aerobic products of decay, and that's just something interesting to note. An interesting note as well is that for aerobic decomposition, carbon, sulfur, phosphorus and nitrogen, they're all in their maximum oxidation state, whereas for anaerobic decomposition, the carbon, sulfur, phosphorus and nitrogen, they're in their minimum oxidation state, and that's just an interesting thing to note. So let's have a look at an example question. It says ammonium ions are a product of the decomposition of kudzu leaves. State whether this decomposition occurs under aerobic or anaerobic conditions. So aerobic conditions for ammonium, so ammonium contains nitrogen. If it was aerobic respiration, nitrate ions would be produced. In this case, ammonium ions, so that's NH4, there's no oxygen there, so that would be done under anaerobic conditions. Now, even though from our table we had ammonia rather than ammonium, all you need is some hydrogen ions in the soil and you'll produce ammonium ions from the ammonia. So a little bit of acid in the soil will produce ammonium ions. So we looked at aerobic and anaerobic decay of compounds containing carbon, sulfur, nitrogen and phosphorus. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya.